Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Breaking Down Policies, Endangering Education and the Environment event. Today we will be discussing Project 2025 and Agenda 47 and how these policy plans will impact our education and the environment. Before we get started, I'd like to kick us off with our land acknowledgement. As we all journey on the trail of life, we wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the indigenous peoples have maintained to Endakina, the homeland, and the land, water, flora, and fauna, which each of our communities is honored to steward today. We also acknowledge the hardships they continue to endure after a loss of unceded homelands and champion everyone's responsibility to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of the indigenous people who carry forward the traditions of their ancestors.
So I'm just going to take a moment to introduce our first speaker, Andru Volinsky. Andru is the instructor of strategy and practice of public policy in the master program at the Carsey School of Public Policy. Andru has a long and distinguished legal career that has blended public policy and litigation as a lawyer in the private practice. He began his career teaching law school and defending death penalty cases in the South. He defended capital cases in Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, and before the U.S. Supreme Court in Gray v. Mississippi. After moving to New Hampshire, he became the lead lawyer in the Claremont School Funding cases that established the constitutional right to public education and overturned New Hampshire's funding scheme as unconstitutional. Andru was elected to serve 2 terms on New Hampshire's executive council and ran for governor in 2020. Andru was New Hampshire counsel to Bernie Sanders in 2016, and he sat on the boards of Rights and Democracy, the Manchester Community Health Center, and the New Hampshire branch of the ACLU, where he was also legal counsel. So I'm going to move the spotlight over to Andru so he can get started.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Open Democracy, the Interfaith Action, and Manchester NAACP for hosting this presentation. And I'm glad to be here with Rob Werner, who knows the environment side of these things. So 10 minutes to tell you about Project 2025. Let's start with the fact that it's the Heritage Foundation. Heritage is a 50-year-old foundation, started in the early 70s, really as a result of the Powell Memo. If some of you know about the Powell Memo, it's a neoconservative, pro-business game plan for what the ultra-conservative teams have done to us in the last 50 years. I think of Heritage as a pseudo-intellectual terrorist organization. I don't joke about that. There was a time when I thought those who were more conservative than me had different approaches to economics. Maybe we just disagreed. And I felt the same way with respect to lawyers. We could disagree, have different approaches, but I gotta say, the idea that Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and I are all members in good standing as lawyers tells me something's wrong. And I quite frankly have trouble thinking of them as just having a little bit different view. So Heritage got together. They actually had been doing this for generations now. They were most influential in the Reagan presidency, some in Bush and some in Clinton. They put together these packages of policy mandates, and then they tried to influence the administrations to adopt them. They've now really taken that effort up a bunch of notches. They've combined with 45 other organizations, according to their website. These organizations will be familiar to you. They're Moms for Liberty, Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life, the Eagle Forum, Family Research Council, Hillsdale College, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and some you don't know, the Alabama Policy Institute, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Not the brightest of lights, but certainly the most conservative. So the Heritage Foundations come up with this Project 2025, and they have different subject areas, one of which is education. And I've been asked to talk about that. This tragedy has 4 acts. The first act is their book of policy matters. It's called The Mandate for Leadership. They used the same title back in the Reagan administration. Second, they've created a database that Heritage calls a conservative LinkedIn. Again, during the Trump administration, they did something very similar. It's to the executive branch what the Federalist Society is to the judiciary. That is, they look for and mold and encourage people with a certain frame of reference, and then boost them up into positions where they can make public policy. So they have the mandate for leadership, the nasty Rolodex, if you will. They have what they call the Presidential Administration Academy. This, I kid you not, is an online training program for future leaders in federal government, put together by the Heritage Foundation. It's for non-wonky aspirants to executive branch position. Finally, the 4th act is the playbook. That's how they convert their policies into practice during the first 180 days. So in the area of education, the playbook centers on the idea of dismantling the Department of Education and shifting local and state monies as much as they possibly can to voucher programs. Their justifications for these efforts are pretty clearly designed to reach certain constituencies. So part of their justifications are to reach the culture warriors. So they put in their document that they need to fight critical race theory, and they need to address transgendered and non-binary children in our public schools. That's a clear bone to these culture warriors. Next, their agenda plays to the bougie suburbanites who want the public to pay for their kids to go to private schools. And in this, they really focus a lot on the Arizona experience. Arizona has universal vouchers. I'll come back to them in a moment. And then finally, they rely on a clearly debunked justification that money doesn't matter in education. That's a claim that plays to their basest instincts of their followers. And let's talk about that for a moment. So money doesn't matter is an argument that came out of the Coleman report in 1966. The argument is you can dump as much money as you want into education and it won't make a difference for some kids. Back in the 70s, leading newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, sometimes referred to those kids as slum kids. We know what they were talking about. The problem is Coleman's research wasn't advanced enough. Coleman didn't have the broad databases. He didn't have all of the tools to analyze the data. Those claims that money doesn't make a difference have been thoroughly rejected by recent research, particularly that by a professor named C. Carabo Jackson at Northwestern. He reanalyzed the actual data in 31 studies on this point, and his conclusion, which is now broadly accepted, is that if you sustainably introduce extra money to a school system over a few years, you can show exactly how it will improve student achievement. The Heritage Foundation ignores all this. It makes like we're back in 1966 making these arguments. The arguments are ridiculous on their face. Who wouldn't think that more time with a caring adult makes a difference? Who wouldn't think that a brand new colorful textbook would do better than a black and white textbook that's old and that Susie's little brother spit up on last year? The idea doesn't make any sense, but it's had cachet in court cases and in legislatures. And so we need to be careful to debunk it. What else? What does this plan really want to do? Well, if you destroy, take apart the Department of Education, you no longer have a seat at the table. That intangible means a lot to reduce education from its cabinet level position. But there are a bunch of programs. What happens to the Department of Education programs? Well, it's as if Heritage was trying to put together a puzzle of where to put these functions that even they admit need to be looked out for, but their puzzle didn't quite fit. So they got out the scissors and they cut off the odd pieces of the puzzle that wouldn't go into the missing space. So for example, with special ed, really important function of the Department of Education is to distribute monies and supervise state special ed programming. This document wants to move special ed from the Department of Education, I want to get the right name, to the Department of Health and Human Services Bureau called the Administration for Community Living. The mission of the administration is, quote, advancing independence and inclusion of older adults and people with disabilities around the fundamental principle that older adults and people of all ages with disabilities should be able to live where they choose. That's an admirable mission. It has nothing to do with the education of children with qualifying disabilities. And you wonder what reason you have to put it there other than it had to go somewhere. So if you care about special education, if you care about children who get special education services, you need to be really concerned about what Project 2025 is going to do to your children. There's more, of course. They want to get rid of the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. They want to privatize the college loan programs so that someone connected with Heritage, I assume, can make a buck. Expect those programs to be less well funded in the future without advocates and without support from an agency. I said I'd come back to vouchers. Let me end with vouchers and then turn it back over to the program leads. Vouchers, I hope you know, have a terrible history. Their origin story comes from the South's reaction to Brown versus Board decision requiring desegregation. Rather than desegregate, whole school systems in the South closed down. The best example, maybe the worst example, is Prince Edward County in Virginia. They closed their public schools for 5 years to fight off desegregation. And what happened to the white kids? They went to private academies that replaced the public schools, and then their parents sought tuition reimbursements from the State Board of Education for those academies. that's where vouchers come from. Here's an interesting insight. Justice Lewis Powell, who wrote the Powell memo, his law firm defended Prince Edward County in their efforts when they closed schools. Anyway, Arizona is touted by the Heritage Foundation because it has the broadest universal voucher program in the country. There are no income limits. Anyone, regardless of income, can apply for a voucher. They're called education savings accounts in Arizona and get the money to apply to private school tuitions. The Brookings Institute did a study of what was happening in Arizona, and they found a straight line relationship between family wealth and use of vouchers. The 10% of families with the highest income in the state made the highest use of vouchers. They were supporting their own kids' already existing placements in private schools. And the families in the 10% lowest portion of the economy had the lowest use of vouchers. So all of this justification that you hear about vouchers being necessary to help children in poor school districts doesn't play out. Frank Edelblum makes that same argument here. Despite his being an accountant and a businessman, he can't do the accounting on New Hampshire's education freedom accounts. He predicted they would cost $300,000 a year. The program actually cost $8 million the first year, $15 million the second year, and somewhere around $25 million in the third year. And now he says the program is too complex to be audited. So there's a lot to worry about here. We already have people in our state who are advancing some of the principles that Project 2025 has about education. We need to be informed, we need to be careful, and we need to respond. And let me pause there, and then we can decide if I'm answering questions now or if we're going to put them off till after Rob speaks.
All right, I don't see any questions posed in the chat, so I think we'll go ahead and move over to Rob so that we can get started on that. So let me give him an introduction. So Rob Werner is the New Hampshire State Director of the League of Conservation Voters, a national advocacy organization that works to turn environmental values into national, state, and local priorities. Rob formerly served as National Field Director of Americans for Campaign Reform. Rob is a graduate of Northfield Herman School and the University of Vermont. He earned a master's of business administration from Suffolk University, as well as 2 certificates from the Harvard Kennedy School. Senior managers in state and local government and climate change and energy policy. Rob served on the Concord City Council, chairing the Energy and Environmental Advisory Committee. And so with that, I will introduce Robert.
All right, well, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me here. So it's very interesting to listen to Andrew's presentation and to be reminded of the radical nature of Project 2025 and the very fundamental effort that these folks have in mind to change our country for the worse. And I will say that you might have noticed in the debate recently that former President Trump said, "I don't know anything about this. I have no idea who these people are," and so forth, which is obviously not true, since so many folks that served with him and in his administration are intimately involved in the development of these plans. On environment, Project 2025, on environment, climate action, clean energy investments, Project 2025 would really eviscerate so many of the programs that have proved to be successful. Even very long-standing successful programs that had wide bipartisan support when they were first adopted way back in the 70s, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. More recently, in terms of legislative work, Project 2025 would repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, which has resulted in the largest investment of clean energy dollars into our economy, which is already reaping benefits for many of our citizens and municipalities. The law would repeal the Infrastructure Act, which is really mind-boggling to me because, as you might remember, the previous administration had talked about how we were going to have Infrastructure Week and Infrastructure Month, and nothing ever happened of any consequence. And under the Biden-Harris administration, what you saw was actually getting this done. And if you're driving around New Hampshire and the country, it may be a little inconvenient at times, but you are seeing these dollars at work right now in terms of investing in infrastructure changes that we and upgrades that we sorely need. These investments not only are creating jobs for folks, it is a form of economic development. You have to have workable infrastructure to be able to have economic development and to move people around where they need to go. Things very basic like that. So this administration, if it were to take office and implement Project 2025, they would obviously, as they have done before, withdraw us from the Paris Accord, which the Biden-Harris administration had rejoined. And that's very important. As imperfect as these global conferences are, and I've been to 2 of them, it is the one venue that we have to really put on the table needed international cooperation around climate and clean energy investments. So it does have a positive effect, and us withdrawing again from the Paris Climate Accord would have significant negative effects in terms of our international standing. Project 2025 would also undermine things such as the Act, the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate many kinds of dangers that are facing us. I think one of the successes that we've had very recently, and we certainly are suffering from it in this state, is EPA money coming down to deal with our PFAS issues in terms of the forever chemicals. Well, lo and behold, Project 2025 would repeal that, get rid of those investments, get rid of that money. It's really a wholesale retreat, actually, of so many things that people would want to see in their communities and widely support. And it's a sort of over-handing of our government to fossil fuel interests. Even mention of climate change would wholly be removed again from federal information, as it has in some states, like Florida. So we're talking about a very broad assault on long-standing and very popular environmental protections and what we need to do to combat the crisis of climate change. We all see the impacts of climate change around us, certainly in this state, with increasing storms, flooding. Look at the extreme heat that we continue to experience, which is getting worse, not only in this state, but particularly in the Southwest. Even our wildlife in the state is being very much impacted. I think you've heard about over the years the impact on our moose population because the winters are no longer so predictably deep and cold. And so we have at least half of our juvenile moose population has been decimated because of winter ticks. These are real things, and people care about them. But I think that we really need to fight against this because I think it's very much proven, particularly over the last year, as these monies start to flow to communities and also to consumers, that we can fight these trends and we can meet the challenge of climate change, but we can do it in a way that's going to provide economic opportunity for our communities and jobs for our citizens. So things even like the consumer tax credits that are now becoming available, it's been taking a little longer than we wanted to, expected to, but it's coming. So that consumers would be able to make their homes more energy efficient, buy more energy efficient appliances, install heat pumps, which are far more efficient than current heating systems, but also be able to get a financial benefit from them. All of that would be scrapped under these plans. So it doesn't help anyone in terms of their personal life and making their lives better and making their homes more secure and comfortable, which also has a public health impact, by the way, in terms of people's ability to deal with disease and allergies and things of that nature. It all is connected in this way. So I just want to caution folks about the very radical aspect of these plans and the danger that they represent, not only to our efforts to combat the impacts of climate change, but as I said, to basic public health, because climate change and public health are very much connected. And so let's do everything we can to make sure that this does not happen and that people understand the implications of something as basic as the protection of our environment and why we need to protect it. So want to close with that. If there are any questions that people have in terms of specifics around environment, energy, climate, I'd be happy to take them.
Yes, thank you. My name is Volinsky. I'm part of, I'm the education chair for the Manchester NAACP. And as we hear about the plans created or offered in Project 2025, particularly the ones that deal with the environment, what is the justification or rationalization for these policies that would end up actually harming the constituency that they're supposed to be serving? Thank you.
Well, as Andrew said, this comes out of the heritage world, and you know they have a very skewed, I would say, ideological view of the world, and that this really caters to far-right elements of the Republican Party and the country, and attempts to implement a whole range of aspects based on its ideology. I know many small government conservatives who nonetheless have placed a value on environmental protection. But this goes far beyond that. I just really think it's an implementation of a very defined worldview and caters to a very small group of folks in this country. But 2025, not only beyond education and environment, climate, and energy. I mean, you're talking about initiatives that would raise taxes on many people, even families making $100,000 a year or less, would still see substantial tax increases. And as we have seen in the past, those at the upper brackets of our income would continue to see very large income tax reductions. Fits in this ideological frame. In the same way, in the environment area, this whole notion of environmental justice and trying to redress the wrongs of the past, which are many in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure being placed in the disadvantaged communities that had no political power, and the harms that resulted in. These folks have they don't care about any of that stuff. They think it's woke, it's just really not in their ideological frame. But we think very differently. Matter of fact, I would maintain that the Inflation Reduction Act and the investments that we are making in clean energy infrastructure and working with communities, at least have to start in trying to redress some of these past wrongs, particularly in ways of training and making those training and job opportunities available to people that have been shut out in the past. This is an opportunity to do something different and frankly redress, as I said, wrongs that have been done in the past. But as I said, these folks really don't have any notion of that, nor do they particularly care about that.
It looks like Andrew actually has a comment to make.
Okay.
Yeah, hey, Rob.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Don't go anywhere.
Okay.
The Heritage Foundation actually has a couple of reasons why they're advocating for the 2025 project on their website. One just makes no sense and it's clearly false, but the other does give you some insight. So the one that's clearly false is that the Heritage Foundation complains about the oppression and dangers of one-party rule in Washington. Well, if anyone's paying any attention, they know there is not one-party rule in Washington. It's such a divided government, it's hard to do anything. So that reason makes no sense. It's just something the Heritage Foundation trots out. But the reason that does make sense is that they've decided that simply withdrawing and withholding resources from government in order to strangle it does not work. And so what they propose to do is to commandeer the resources of government with like-minded people, people who will lead agencies and not believe in the mission of the agency. For me, Betsy DeVos is the prime example of that. She was against public education and she was the education secretary under Trump.
Oh.
So they're trying to put people like that in place, and then they're going to promote people whose relationship with reality isn't all that clear. So I'm looking for Marjorie Taylor Greene to become Secretary of Commerce or HUD under Trump. God forbid that should happen. But those are the kind of people they want to promote, people who are extreme in their views and unending in their ambition.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that in terms of the Heritage Foundation and their history, and particularly as you say, and as I like to say, as so many others like to say, which I think is a truism, is that personnel is policy. And it really matters who has their hands on the levers. And one of the things that's interesting in my world is that Heritage, years ago, came up with two things that they now completely absolve themselves of and probably would not admit that they ever supported them, put them forward. One is in the environmental area, where they were the ones who proposed a whole system of what's called cap and trade, in terms of trading carbon credits, a free market, more of a market-oriented system. Well, let's talk about acid rain. Well, let's not, because we don't talk about it anymore. Why is it that we don't talk about it anymore? Because we solved the problem. We solved that problem under the Reagan and Bush administrations with bipartisan support that created a cap and trade program that traded sulfur credits from these plants in the Midwest that were producing these emissions that then, because of prevailing winds, came over our area, created acid rain. As a matter of fact, Hubbard Brook Research Foundation here in New Hampshire was the discoverer of acid rain. So we don't talk about that anymore because we solved it. And we solved it in part from a concept that came from a more conservative market-oriented side in the Heritage Foundation. In the healthcare sector, healthcare section or area, what did they come up with? the employer mandate around healthcare, with the notion that is correct, that if you're going to have an insurance system, you got to spread the risk to everyone. Because otherwise you're going to have all sorts of problems within the market. Well, they would probably never admit that they ever supported these things, but it's interesting to me that at one point it was seemed to be a point of pride for them, and that they did. And frankly, those at the time, and it shows you how radical they have shifted at the time, and looking backwards, certainly, we may have some disagreements, but those are actually rational policy developments that can have a positive effect. But you would hear nothing of that now from this group of people.
So did anyone have any questions they wanted to pose now that we've all had our time to really delve into these topics?
Rob, given, how things went in the legislature with the bills this year, and, we have the LSRs, some of them, to pour over. If we had to come up with a strategy that would give the most leverage for getting some solid climate, healthy environment legislation through, we have a little bit of a wrinkle in our cloth in the executive council, of course, like funding things. But and given that it's going to be an interesting budget year, and given that the nature of the governorship in New Hampshire isn't strong, does it mean that our efforts really need to get down to the nitty-gritty of our legislators and the executive council to get stuff done when we are working on the elections?
Yeah, I'd answer that in a couple of ways. I mean, from our point of view, one of the things that would actually make the biggest difference in our lives would be a pro-environment governor. Notwithstanding the fact that, as you point out, the New Hampshire governor office is relatively weak statutorily, constitutionally, compared to maybe some of the other governors around us.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, whoever that person is sets the tone.
Right.
And that's really important.
Yeah.
And as we saw in a issue that is not environmentally related, but has huge consequences no matter what area we're involved with. As you saw the Governor Sununu, after a lot of waffling and back and forth and leading us to believe that he was not going to do this, signed the most restrictive voting rights bill in the United States.
Yeah.
Last week.
Yeah, he's
I think
perfect.
he did it primarily, in my view, because, well, first of all, it was held for a long time for defined political purposes, so it wouldn't necessarily affect this election.
Yep.
But I think he signed it because he didn't want to upset the Republican base in a way to have them criticize him
Right.
in the context of having his desired successor, Kelly Ayotte, cause any problems for her. That's why I think he did what he did. So my hope is that we're in a position to repeal it. However, that just tells you that, yeah, it really matters who's governor. It does, but it matters who is chair of science, tech, and energy in the House, and it matters who's chair of energy and natural resources in the Senate. I think that there's an opportunity for us, if we get the right mix of people, to make some really good policy next year and to catch up with the rest of New England.
Okay.
But it's only going to happen in terms of the people we place in office. That is the bottom line.
Right.
So yes.
Yep. Thanks.
Sure.
All right, were there any other last minute burning questions? All right, I'm not seeing any in the chat. So let's move forward to the call to action, and I am gonna bring up Reverend Renee so she can talk about some of these upcoming events and activities.
Hi. You can be volunteering for the Granite State to reach out to voters, Granite State, Interface Action. They are reaching out to voters and canvassing Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, so you could call that number, the 603-232-0202 if you're interested. You could speak to at least one person about what you learned here today. Vote on November 5th. And I believe today is National Registration Day to vote. And get on vote.org and register. So you could talk to your friends and make sure everybody you know is registered to vote, and they can do that effective today. We have like another breaking down policies on October 15th. We will be having a discussion about whether or not we're going to do that in person or not, and probably just do it online. But that will be covering women's rights, the LGBTQ community, as well as persons with disabilities. So we'll have 3 different speakers, and that will be happening at 6 o'clock on the 15th, which is also a Tuesday, I believe, from 6 to about 7:30. And it'll be sponsored by the same 3 organizations that you heard from tonight. Open Democracy will be doing a book club, Democracy in Black, September 24th at 7 p.m. If that is something you're interested, please participate. Open Democracy also has a book club, December 11th at 7 p.m., which is Democracy Awakening. And the NAACP is a Freedom Fund dinner, October 19th at 5:30 in Bedford. Can't remember the Bedford, is it the Bedford Center? Event Center is where we're having that, yes.
All right, and that is it.
That is it. We are so appreciative and grateful for all of you who participated this evening. I hope to see you October 15th. And also hope that if you have anything that we could do better, that you would let us know that. And we really apologize for the technology problems that we ran into this evening. But look forward to seeing you again. Please, please invite your friends. And anything you learned tonight, please make sure you pass it on. And pass it on some more. Have a good evening.